You don't have to spend a fortune on expensive model kits to make some awesome looking miniatures. I bought this cheap baby doll from the thrift store and turned it into a horrifying monster. And I'm going to show you step by step how I made it and how you can do it yourself as well. I made a few quick sketches of how I plan to turn this baby doll into a demonic monster. And I will probably use the head and legs as the main part of the monster. I took off all the clothes and took off the arms, legs and the head. Now that I have all the separate pieces, I needed to make room for the big mouth. So I cut out a large section from the bottom of the head. And now that I can reach the inside of the head, I also removed one of the eyes, because I have something special in mind for it. I then stuffed the head with aluminium foil to fill out most of the empty space. For all the sculpting, I decided to use some Milliput. This is a cheap epoxy putty which comes in 2 parts, which you have to mix in a 1:1 ratio. After that you can mold and shape it for a few hours before it completely hardens. I made 2 flat sheets and used these to cover both sides of the mouth, carefully smoothing it out and shaping it around the edges to create some sort of lips. I also added these lines to the lips, which will hopefully look cool in the end. I'm not an experienced sculptor by any means, so if you have any tips, be sure to let me know in the comments down below. And I'll also leave links to both the Milliput and the sculpting tools I'm using in the description. The empty eye socket got a similar treatment as the mouth. I used a small flat piece of Milliput to cover the hole, and I rolled up 2 small Milliput snakes to sculpt the eyelids from. The eyelids were sculpted similarly to the lips of the mouth. I just smoothed it out and added a few creases. I also added teeth to the mouth, which I made using the ends of some wooden skewers. I pushed those into a little Milliput ball and put them inside the mouth. In the end, the Milliput ball will hopefully make it look like they're the gums of the teeth. Remember the eye I removed earlier? Well, my plan was to use it to make some sort of eye stalk bursting from the head of the baby. To do this, I used one of the arms I removed from the baby earlier. I cut off the hand on one side, and I also cut off the original connection point of the arm to change the angle at which it would be connected to the head. I glued the eye to the end of the arm. I made 2 more flat pieces of Milliput to cover the connection with the eye to the arm, and I rolled up 2 snakes to sculpt the eyelids around the eye itself. And I attached it to the body using some Milliput and some super glue. To cover the connection between the arms and the head, I made 2 more flat pieces of Milliput and I sculpted them around the connection. I really wanted it to look like the eye stalk had burst through the skin of the head, so I only smoothed it out on the side of the head to make it blend in more and left the other side exposed. Next, I wanted to move on to attaching the legs. But the ears were in the way, so I had to cut them off using my hobby knife. I did this because I also wanted to connect the legs to the sides of the head in the same way. And I again used some flat Milliput pieces to smooth out the connection between the legs and the head. To break up the smooth texture of the skin, I also sculpted on 2 little horns. I shaped them by hand first and stuck them on. And after that, I also sculpted some lines into them to give them some more texture. I then moved on to adding some nasty looking boils to the skin. I simply smoothed out some Milliput on the skin, and I used a round sculpting tool, or you could just use the end of a brush, to create a bunch of small indentations. And then I moved on to other parts of the skin. Using some baking soda and superglue, I created some texture on the top of the head. I thought this could maybe look like some sort of a nasty scab if I painted it up right. And for some of the other blank parts on the skin, I just used some filler and stippled it on to create even more texture. Next, I moved on to the base, which I made from a CD, some styrofoam packaging and a cork coaster. The CD is nice because it's flat, round and it doesn't warp. The styrofoam is great to add some variation in height, and the cork coaster has a really nice texture. Especially if you tear the coaster apart, it has really nice rock-like edges. To cover up the styrofoam and fill the gaps, I used my DIY texture paint. You can make this by simply mixing some wall or wood filler with a bit of sand and brown ink. This creates a really nice thick texture paste. The reason I added some brown ink into it is in case a small piece of it ever chips off. That way you won't see the white color of the filler, but you will see the brown color instead, which hopefully blends in a lot more with the base. Lastly, I sprinkled on some sand and smaller pebbles to fill out some of the bigger gaps and add some more variation and texture on the base. After the texture paint had dried, I used some watered down PVA to cover all of the sand and pebbles to make sure that they stayed stuck down on the base. I also covered the eyes of the baby demon using some blue tack to protect them from the spray primer. I won't glue the monster to the base just yet, as it will be a lot harder to paint if I do so already. And now I'm finally ready to move on to the painting. This is where it all really comes together. To make sure the paint would stick to both the base and the baby, I primed both of them using a cheap dollar store black spray primer. After that, the blue tack needed to be removed from the eyes, and I painted the areas around the eyes black as well. I then moved on to base coating the model. For the skin, I decided to use a purple color. I mixed in the darker and a lighter purple for the highlights and the shadows. I used wet blending to get smooth transitions. For the lips of the mouth and the eye scar, I used the same color as the skin, but with a bit more red mixed in to make it a bit lighter and pinker. I then highlighted the edges of the folds in the lips and the scar using a pink color. And after that I applied the purple wash over it to tie it all together. I painted the inside of the mouth using the same bright pink I used for the highlights before. And to darken it down a little bit, I then applied a dark reddish wash over it. Then I moved on to painting the teeth in the mouth using an off-white color, and I used the same off-white color to paint the horns on the head of the baby. And after that I gave both the teeth and the horns a sepia wash. I painted the boils on the skin using a sickly green color and wet blended it in. After that I applied the same wash I used in the mouth, but I thinned it down a lot because it was a bit too strong. And I used this to make it look even more sickly and disgusting. For some of the other texture on the skin, I simply applied a few different washes to set it apart from the rest of the skin and give it a bit of a different tone. I then dry brushed most of it using the same green color I used for the boils to make it pop out a bit more. I did the same with the scab on the head. I gave it a few different washes to give it a nice dirty color, and then I dry brushed using a few different colors on top of that. The eye stalk I wanted to have a bit more of a realistic skin color, so I painted this using a pale skin color. The paint I used for this, however, had quite poor coverage. So for the second coat I mixed in a more opaque brown color to improve the coverage before applying a third coat. And while that dried, I started painting the arteries on the eye stalk and the leg. For this I used a red paint with the respective skin colors mixed into them. To highlight the skin on the eye stalk, I gradually mixed in an even lighter skin color and wet blended it until it got a nice gradient. And I did the same for the underside, but by mixing in a slightly darker brown to create a nice shadow color. And as a final touch for this model, I added some blood effect on certain spots. I applied it on the teeth in the mouth and the lips as I thought it would be really appropriate. I also applied it on the scar on the eye because I thought it would be nice if it looked like all disgusting with some blood dripping out. And I also used it on the spot where the eye stalk came through the head, and I used it on some of the boils to make them look even more nasty. I then gave the mouth, lips, eyes and the boils a coat of gloss varnish to make them look a bit moist and add to the disgustingness. No model is complete without a base, so let's move on to that. Since we applied the texture paint quite thickly, there are some small cracks and brush strokes visible on the base. So I mixed up another small batch of my DIY texture paint, this time with some yellow mixed in. Then I stippled it all over the spots which showed brush marks or cracks to hide it and give it a nicer texture. After that all dried, I mixed some brown and yellow paints to base coat the entire base. When doing this, you don't need to cover all the texture paint we applied before, as some variation in the colors on the base will look quite nice. I also mixed in a bit of a darker brown to paint all the bigger pebbles on the base with a slightly darker color to give even more variation to the color on the base. Once that all had dried, I applied a brown wash all over the base and dry brushed it using a warm off-white color. And then as a final touch, I added a few of these nice tufts, as I thought the pink would match well with the model itself. And then lastly, I drilled a small hole in the front foot of the monster to add a small pin, and then I glued the entire model onto the base. Honestly, I'm super happy with the result, and I hope it inspired you and showed you that you don't need to buy expensive miniature kits just to pursue this hobby. And if you're keen to play games with custom miniatures like these, but you think games like Warhammer are too expensive or just too complicated to get into, check out this video where I show you a free beginner-friendly tabletop game. And if you've made it this far into the video, please consider subscribing to my channel and leaving me a like. It would really help me out. Thank you so much.